and welcome to the very first episode of the OFFENE Discourse, the Open Discourse. Cultural, philosophical, historical, long-form interview podcast kind of thingy where I get people that really know this stuff and have them sit down with me, talk for more than an hour about stuff that really interests me while I get to record it and upload it to YouTube later on for your and my own pleasure. I guess that's the best description I can give of this project. The first episode of the OFFENE Discourse was already recorded last July in my old studio before we moved house, and unfortunately due to the house moving I am only now able to release it. My very first guest was Dr. Robert Harris. Originally from the US, he emigrated to the Netherlands where he studied piano and became a pianist and educator, where he works among other things at the Groningen Conservatory, where he's a lecturer at the master's program, but he's also part of the research group surrounding the topic of lifelong learning, which is a topic we touched upon also in our discussion. Last but not least, he's also a neurologist, and as such he released his PhD thesis in 2017, which is called The Cerebral Organization of Audiomotor Transformations in Music. Now that's quite a mouthful, even for a musician. It basically touches upon the questions of what improvisation can do to your brain, but in a very, very scientific manner. It's not an easy read, but we spoke about it in a slightly simplified manner so that even lay people like me can understand what's going on without being a neurologist. And it's a very, very interesting topic, and I highly recommend it to all active professional musicians, but also amateur musicians and anybody who is actually involved in teaching music, because there's some very good things we can take from that research. Now, before we start the interview, I just want to apologize for some of my ramblings in the video. I've edited it down a little bit and cut down a couple of anecdotes that weren't really all that relevant. So if you see some unexpected cuts, I'm not hiding some big truths from you. It's just I'm distilling it down to what I think is the most essential and most interesting for people. Also, let me apologize for my constant yes, which appears in this interview. I'm usually not interviewing people with one of those right in front of me. So whenever I'm trying to give a confirmation to the people I'm talking with, I have to bear in mind that there's actually somebody recording it. And so that creeps in all the time. I can assure you I will improve, and already in my second interview, that is far less the case. So I've hopefully learned my lesson. But now, without further ado, please enjoy Dr. Robert Harris on music, improvisation, the brain, and many other very interesting things.
No, it's a rather complex issue, of course, but actually it's there are two answers to that question. Because learning a music instrument is actually a kind of double skill. Just like learning a language, we obviously have to learn to move our lips and our tongue and that sort of thing. But as we not only learn how to make the sounds of the language, we also learn the grammar of the language.
Right.
And that's the same, of course, in music. We have to learn to distinguish pitches and rhythms. But at the same time, we have to learn the music syntax. Right. And those are two different things that are learned in very similar ways, of course, but you can't approach them as one thing. You have to realize that there are two different aspects. And of course, we know a lot more about the brain now than we did when I studied human movement science. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. That was actually really the beginning of the whole revolution in neuroscience. If you look at the articles and books on the brain now, they always are talking about the predicting brain. Mm-hmm. The brain that is thinking ahead of time what is going to come. And of course, that is not only in terms of perception. For example, is that a door? Or something like that. But also, for example, in a sentence, When is the verb going to come? And of course,
Right.
if you speak German, you wait until the very end. But you have these expectations
Right.
in language that we call grammar, of course, and we have to learn those in a very similar way. But the basic idea is that the brain is thinking ahead,
Right. Yeah.
you could say. And of course, how can you know what the effects of your movements will be? How does a baby lying in the crib, how does a baby know what's going to happen when it makes a p sound?
Yeah.
The only way it can know is by hearing the sound that it makes, and the brain immediately connects this movement to the sound.
Yeah.
And this is what we call idiomotor learning. And of course, if you think about that idiomotor learning, it starts with a movement. In the case of a baby, it's a random movement.
Right.
But of course, any movement I make will make a sound or a feeling, or also, for example, the proprioception, the feeling of movement in your body. These the sensory feedback that we get when we make movements is something that we use to learn to make movements.
Right.
And so if you think about it in that way, then learning to make music has to start with movement and not with recognition. And what we've done in classical music, actually in our way of teaching, is to replace this idiomotor learning with what we call sensory motor mapping. We put the notes on the piano and then we react to the notes, which is actually more a stimulus response concept, which was very, very popular, of course, in the beginning of the 20th century. But it's not the only way we learn, fortunately. Conditioning. Yeah.
You found in your research also, that much I understood from it, that there are different brain areas being activated when you have a background in improvisation, for instance. So when you have this idiomotoric background, is that correct? Yeah. That there's actually certain areas that light up when you even imagine playing certain music, than if you don't have that background. And so if I understand correctly, that is sort of an area that is activated, which is similar to, as you said, like the prediction that happens in a language. So, which is funny because it reminds me that there is this very common saying that everybody uses these days, and which is quite popular, that music is a universal language. But actually, based on that, wouldn't it be that actually, in a way, many musicians that are brought up as score-dependent musicians aren't really speaking the language freely, but they're just mimicking in a way that language? Is that too daring a statement, or
no? I think you're very right. I mean, for example, imagine that I would become an actor,
right?
And I'm from some country where they don't speak English, but I want to become a Shakespearean actor. Well, then I go to England and I learn to speak British English, and then I become a Shakespearean, or let's say I don't learn to speak British English. I practice pronouncing British English, and so that I can produce Shakespeare plays in my hometown, somewhere in Europe. Yeah, I can learn how to pronounce the language very, very correctly if I have good ears, good ear training, good audiology. I can learn how to speak the language, pronounce it, but not really be able to converse in the language. Those are two different skills.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that we can compare what we do in classical music very much to that idea, which is also, even in singing, there are a lot of singers who don't speak Italian, who sing Italian operas. It's quite possible. And they can sing it with very, very excellent pronunciation, but don't converse with them. Because that's something different.
With German, I hear that a lot with singers, that like you hear a bunch of phonetic syllables, but you don't hear a real sentence or something.
And you can actually hear that.
And you hear, and it's like it's technically it's like that's how that syllable should sound. But altogether it doesn't make sense, and you hear it right away. At least I do. If you're a little bit sensitive to that, I think.
That indicates to me, if that is really the case, which I believe, that the whole question of interpretation in classical music is being approached from the wrong angle. Because if the being able to speak the language is so important for your prosody and all these important aspects of language, why wouldn't it be important for interpretation in classical music?
Absolutely.
And so I would suggest that improvisation is a good way. Learning to speak the musical language at your instrument would be the right way to approach it. Of course, in music, we have one fortunate aspect. We have singing. And that means that every musician can approach music from the angle of singing. And if you actually transfer that to your own instrument, you can go very, very far.
True.
Yeah.
But that is something I remember actually from my own study days, that actually when you would confront, for instance, a student, I didn't have so many students, but I had a few, and you tell them to, they're playing a line, especially on the organ, it is very tricky because of its by nature rather stiff sound, and you feel there's no direction or something, then you say like, well, sing the line. There is very often a huge blockade that if people are not used to that, and I think it is so useful to do that because it immediately gives you an idea of, and especially it opens up your mind to all the different possibilities where you could go actually with such a line, with such a sentence. And I think especially in early music it is so well known, the connection with rhetorics, and you're wondering like, how on earth is it possible that we don't see that there's such a huge variety of ways we could go? There's this whole idea of a certain degree of perfection that needs to be achieved in an interpretation of a piece that's been recorded 100 times already. And you end up in a situation where like the field of view where you could go with a piece of music gets ever narrower. And that is exactly the kind of mimicking of sounds of like, this is how it should sound, this is the ideal pronunciation of it, but it's not really speaking a language, because any given sentence, if you take a poem by Goethe or whatever, or Shakespeare, every actor can pronounce it in, can give it its own inflection. If he really speaks it as a language, he can emphasize different aspects of it. And I think also in semiology, it's very clear that there is this distinct line between the intention of the author, the intention of the work, the intention of the listener. And that's what makes it also interesting. That's why even after 500 years, these things can have meaning for us, because we can always rediscover it and make it meaningful for us. While the pure mimicry itself loses it's not alive in a way.
Now, what disturbs me even more than the influence of the recording industry, which I would agree with you, is rather large nowadays. But of course, for the average musician who doesn't make recordings, that's not the.
But they all listen to them.
They all listen to recordings, and of course, their teachers all tell them.
Even worse, exactly. Teachers telling students that they should go home, listen to a recording, and imitate that.
I don't hear them doing that. I hear them saying the opposite. I hear lots of teachers saying, "Don't listen to recordings," or avoid listening to one recording. So this effect of the recording is of course recognized, but what disturbs me more is that students learn one interpretation.
Right.
So their practicing is oriented towards finding the interpretation of the piece.
Right.
And I remember a remark. I think it was about Glenn Gould, that he did not ever write fingerings in his score because he played the piece differently every time he played it. And then the fingerings would be disturbing for the different possible interpretations. What I see is that students are really putting it into concrete, I can put it that way, that they have a fixed interpretation that they repeat again and again and again. And maybe that does change in the course of time, but it doesn't change per concert. And my experience as a musician, of course, I was an accompanist for many years, and every time you play the same piece with a different violinist, you obviously have to change your interpretation. So it's a very practical reason to change your interpretation constantly, and to be able to change an interpretation. But even playing solo literature, why would you want to play the same phrase twice the same way? In language, we don't do that. In language, every time we say a sentence, we emphasize a different syllable or a different word, or we try to mean something a little bit different. And because music is in that sense also has lots of loose ends, that the composer is not telling us one way to say something. He's giving us all sorts of possibilities that we can exploit. And so the way we practice already makes it rather uniform.
Exactly. So you also write in here about the idea that rather than just repeating and repeating over and over again, that actually a more analytic view of like the harmonic structure and all the things that are going on, and trying to actually get behind the concept of the piece rather than actually just repeating a certain technical problem over and over again.
No, actually, that's not what I'm saying. In classical music, of course, we place a very, very high value on analysis.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with analysis. I mean, you can analyze a piece of you can analyze literature, and poem. You can do all these things. But actually, on the I'm talking about a lower level, the mastery of the music language, of the syntax. And of course, when we learn a language, you can learn a language in two different ways. We all know that as children that we learned the language procedurally, which is what it's called, procedural learning or implicit learning, that you learn the grammar without any instruction in the theory, in the grammar, without any analysis, but you learn it by doing.
Learning by doing.
And in classical music, and even nowadays in a lot of jazz instruction, analysis is kind of has replaced the idea of learning by doing, because we don't know exactly how to do that. Implicit learning is by nature implicit, and of course in formal education, how will you stimulate implicit learning? We frequently don't know. That's a little bit of our problem. And so we go from procedural learning to what we call declarative learning. We learn it from a book. You go to high school and you learn French. You memorize the grammar. You do the exercises, and then you go to Paris and you try to buy some bread in the store, and it doesn't work. And I've seen this happen. My oldest son had the lowest grades you can think of at high school for French for many years, until he went to France to work for 2 months in a restaurant, and came home speaking fluent French. And we make the same mistake in music, that we actually approach the whole idea of music syntax from the analytical point of view, instead of the practical point of view. Right now, it's very interesting. In Amsterdam at the Conservatory, my colleague David Engels has developed a new method of practicing for classical pianists that he's implementing in the Young Talent course there. He calls it musicianship because we don't have a word for it. But what he's doing is he's trying to teach students not to play the notes of the piece that they're studying, but to try to play the notes the composer could have written. Of course, we all know that from the 19th century, the fact that pianists transposed. One of the things that a pianist can do is say, well, Mozart wrote the Sonata Facile in C major, but how would it sound in D major? Pianists never do that. But of course, you can also ask the question, how would it have sounded in D minor? But you can also say, well, he's modulating to the dominant here. He could have modulated to the parallel, to the relative minor. Now, try it. He could have used a different accompaniment here. How would that sound? He uses this accompaniment in the second section. Why not use it in the first section? So he's teaching classical pianists who cannot improvise, what we call improvisation. He's using actually improvisation as a method to approach a score.
Right.
And this is obviously a little bit different from what we call analysis. It is, you could say it has a certain element of analysis in it. Nothing wrong with that. But the learning is, in general, you could say the learning is procedural and not declarative.
I was thinking that in a way, so what you're describing with this musicianship that David Engels is doing, that now we're back to this idea of language and predicting how the syntax of a language works, and that always reminds me that I've had in the past in some of the churches where I was working, I would have some people come to me after service, and then you play some Bach piece as a postlude or something like that, and they would say that with Bach I know what is coming. Which is funny because on one hand there's the thing that yes, you know that of course it had to go there or it must have gone there, but it's a totally different thing to recognize that it makes sense that it went there, that there is this predictability on one hand, but actually coming up with it on your own is a whole different story, because otherwise everybody could be writing like Bach, and that is not the case. And what you also said about the fact that nowadays everything is analytical, and I keep thinking about that historically, that with the introduction of the conservatoire system, with the Paris Conservatoire, and the division of the learning process into clearly organized, which is of course a very enlightened idea and very much in the sense of the French Revolution, that like now you have a subject for oral skills and there you listen to jumps here and there. But before that, if we look at Bach, I mean, Bach didn't have a formal training in a conservatoire like that, and of course he had definitely spent time learning counterpoint and learning separate things, but they always would be tied in with practical purpose, and it would, I think, otherwise it is unimaginable that at a very young age already people back then would have a proficiency in the musical language, which was so complete, which I think is impossible if you don't, from the very beginning, try to learn it, as you said, as a language, as a mother tongue in a way.
I think you're right that you have to learn at a very young age. I also think you're right that the development of the conservatoire in Europe changed the way we teach music. But I think it's important to realize that in music training that reading notes is a completely different skill than playing an instrument or singing. And we kind of forget that because all of us are literate. There was a time that people spoke German or English without being able to read or write. And we can't imagine that anymore. And we don't even imagine the impact it has had on our own oral mastery of the language.
Right.
But reading is a different skill. And unfortunately, in music training, we haven't thought a lot about that. Someone who did think a lot about that, of course, was Zoltan Kodály. And the Kodály method is actually a reading method. He's teaching students how to read notes. And but of course, before you learn to read any language, you have to speak the language. We forget that at high school when we try to teach people how to learn French, and particularly if you're learning something like Hebrew, the first thing they teach you is the alphabet. Not speaking the language, but teaching you the alphabet. So we've lost the idea that you have to learn to speak the language first and then learn how to read and write. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, that improvisation as a musical skill just disappeared after the conservatoire arrived, because probably improvisation was seen as something very difficult to teach. And because, of course, in the practical situation in concerts, it became less and less important. I think it kind of died out for some reason in what we call classical music.
Right.
And so there are all sorts of influences that have.
But why did it die out? Do you have any idea? I mean, what came first, the conservatoire or the dying out?
I'm not sure that the conservatoire can be blamed for the dying out of improvisation. I think it's an aesthetic thing that the whole concept of what music is changed towards the end of the 19th century. And still that's a major debate, of course, in what direction should music go. It's always interesting to look at history and see what composers began doing. For example, in the 20th century, you have so many different solutions to the problem of what should I write. But what they didn't do was, of course, what the jazz musicians did was to go into improvisation. So the whole idea of improvisation was taken over by world music and jazz, and I think that's unfortunate, and maybe that will change. I don't know.
Because you mentioned literacy, and I'm thinking now also about musical literacy, not only among trained musicians, so the performers, but also for the public. And I'm wondering sometimes that, as we said before, that the way we perform music nowadays as a sort of ultra-polished performance, which is sort of like, that's the way it should be, there's beauty in it, but very often it seems that a lot of the appreciation of that music comes from a purely aesthetical point of view. Now, I'm not saying that beauty doesn't matter, because I like Roger Scruton, so I'm definitely in favor of beauty. But beauty for beauty's sake in itself is pointless. But if you grow up in a world, as you said, that people learn to speak before they learn to write, and as such, if improvised music and music as a language, really, in that syntax, was everywhere, was all around, if it was the normal modus operandi, then it certainly probably would have affected also the listening habits of the public, which anyway might have been a more limited public back then, so a certain elite and the aristocracy or whatever. But if they're surrounded by this kind of music making, it might be that they were also more open for that. And then you get a different level of communication, because then actually music is really telling a story to that person, which goes beyond the idea of beauty.
Yeah. I remember a story. Maria Callas spoke Italian, of course, and she lived in Italy and performed at La Scala. And I remember in the big fight that she was having with Renata Tebaldi at that point, she would sometimes on the stage while she was performing an opera, if a particular sentence kind of fitted her relationship with her antagonistic audience, she would turn to the audience and speak sing the sentence to the audience, you know. And I think you're right that the contact with the audience is affected by the way we perform classical music. And so I think our idea of aesthetics has to be reviewed. I think music is about communication. And of course, the discussion of aesthetics, frequently we look down at pop music. But of course, what pop musicians are doing is exactly what we should be doing. They are communicating to their audience, and everybody in our society, you can see that happening. You can see how these people react to these performers, and because that kind of disgusts us, this kind of relationship between the pop artist and these waving audience members, we have kind of reduced the amount of communication that we have in performance to almost null. And of course that has a lot to do with the way we are performing. It has a lot to do with the fact that we are not actually communicating by in the musical language, which is repeating something that everyone knows and of course recognizes, expects. Now they know this is coming. Now they know and they enjoy that, but we're not surprising them in any way,
right?
And not speaking to their particular situation, if I can call it something like that. Yeah.
And that's where I think that, like, this whole idea of music as a language, as a way of communicating, comes in, and I think also if we would be able to really carry that towards the audience, then I think the audience would also be appreciative of it. But because, as you said, like, the pop music world is doing it, and they're successful with it because that's what people ultimately want from music, that it communicates to them. And nowadays, I feel that in concert halls, in a way, I mean, you've probably seen also discussions about scantily clad pianists, for instance. No, I mean, it's there. And
it does happen, yeah.
It does happen. And in a way, it could be argued that, that's also a way of communicating with your audience.
Of course, it's a form of communication. It depends on what you want to communicate.
Exactly. I mean, but it's the thing that, like, it fulfills a desire that when we reach a point where the music making in itself becomes indistinguishable. That's a cruel way of putting it. I don't mean that everybody plays exactly the same, but where the differences are minuscule, that suddenly that this is a way to stand out. But standing out is not just only a way of standing out, but really communicating actually to an audience.
No, of course, the great musicians are the musicians that communicate. Let's
right.
be honest. I mean, we can point to them because they do exist. The fact is that we're not really training our students in that direction.
Right.
We're kind of training them to play the perfect piece.
Right.
And while the great performers are actually communicating.
Yeah.
So that's also a kind of a dichotomy that I see in performance. Yeah. But we're also not aware of what we're communicating because we've never thought about the whole idea that we perform concert music in temples, and that the stage is high for a reason, and that the people are wearing tuxedos for a reason, and that the lighting is there for a reason, and that the framing and the curtains. We don't think about any of these things because we're not really interested in that aspect of music. Yeah.
It feels very often like it's a very idealized image of the music making that we want. I remember I thought about it myself some point recently only, that when I play a concert, I don't only want people to come to listen, or I project, and I think that it applies to many of us. We don't only want people to come to listen, we want them to come to listen for the right reasons. For the reasons that we think are like pure and holy. And if then people come to me after the concert and they say something that doesn't live up to that expectation of high lofty standards of like the highest of art, then we're kind of disappointed. We think like, oh, these people are dumb. I mean, nobody would put it that way, but we tend to think that way, that like, it's disappointing that they don't appreciate it on such a high level as I do. And then it brings me to the question that I've been asking myself for the past 1.5 years, and I think which is the core question which we all need to answer ourselves these days as musicians, which is what role does music play in today's society actually? Because it's not an easy question to answer, and it's also not that there's one correct answer. In the end, I think that is a question that everybody needs to answer for himself. When we're thinking also about like, okay, what is my place in this world? Am I the 20,137th best Bach player in the world? Is that sort of my role? Then who needs that? But I think that if we believe that there is intrinsic value in music and what it can communicate, then all we're interested in is to actually find ways to actually communicate that to people. And and finding and understanding the ways what role it fulfills in a way.
Now we have a little bit of difficulty with aesthetics. We feel, of course, that there are certain works of art that are great works of art, and then there is what we call kitsch. So if my grandson only reads Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, then we think, well, someday he will develop and his taste and read actual literature. And I think we kind of forget that it's not about what you like, but it's about liking. It's about being able to value something for what it is. And I think it's important for my grandson, when he reads Donald Duck, that he is valuing that for what it is, that he has this experience of something wonderful that he's having. The same thing when I drink a glass of wine, it does not really interest me if it's from the right year and from the right chateau or something like that. The most important thing is, what do I think of it? And I think in the terms of aesthetics that we have kind of lost the ability to say, this is what I like. And in literature and in art and in music, we kind of think that our role as classical musicians is to teach people to like things, to like Bach, to like Mendelssohn. I really don't see my role as a teacher in that sense. I teach people to understand what's happening in music by doing it, by playing music, by singing music. I don't teach them to like a particular type of music. And so I think that if we would rethink our role in terms of aesthetics, what am I actually doing when I go out on stage? I'm not trying to fulfill someone's aesthetic prophecies, or I'm not trying to convince them that this is a beautiful piece of music. Not really at all. No. I am trying to communicate what I feel the music is saying to me, to an audience. And I think that's the most authentic type of performance that I can think of. And we frequently see that when you do that, that you actually do communicate. I remember in my own experience as a musician, I discovered at a certain point in my career that when I was teaching a pupil in the studio, and I wanted to demonstrate how I thought a particular phrase should be played, I would play it for the student. And then I recognized the fact that my performing in the studio for the student was much better than out on stage. That out on stage, that my playing was actually very uninteresting and flat. And that I actually was not doing the same thing. I was playing the same notes. I'm sure I was trying to play it very beautifully out on stage, but I was not trying to communicate anything about the music to the people that were sitting there. Right. And in the studio, I was really trying to communicate the beauty of this phrase to my student, who I thought didn't completely understand what was happening in the phrase. And that kind of changed my way of going out on stage. I was playing the same pieces, but completely differently. And I also discovered when I became an accompanist that when I went out on stage with a singer or a violinist, that I was doing something completely different than when I went out on stage by myself. Then I was just playing the piece as well as possible, as beautifully as possible. When I was playing together with a different musician, I was actually really in a dialogue with another musician, and everything the musician did affected what I did. And that was one reason for me to kind of concentrate on chamber music and accompaniment in my own professional career as a pianist. But I also had so much more enjoyment just by communicating with one other person out on stage. It made music for me interesting.
But I'm just also thinking that in a way this is all partially a result of that. For large portions, of course, a big part of our music education these days is a purely reproductive culture, and there comes a point where like you've out interpreted things, and in a way, that's why I think, again, to come back to the idea of improvisation and what it could mean, is that it opens us up to a new way of actually, just communicating the music and focusing on that rather than on the perfect reproduction. I think, that's one thing I still want to say. I told you in the beginning that my first music lesson, my teacher back then gave me a sheet of paper, and on it there were the note values, and he said basically, well, that's a whole note, that's a half note, that's a quarter, and so on. Learn that until next week, and then we start playing pieces. And very first lesson, that's what happened. And very early on I realized that I learned to play pretty well, to play without mistakes, because one thing that was there from the very beginning is that if you don't play what's written there, it's wrong.
It's a mistake.
It's a mistake. And as a child, less so now, but as a child, I was very much a child that wanted to please. I wanted to, people to like me, and in a way, every child wants that. But I didn't want to stick out by doing a mistake. So I learned to play everything very neat, and even with feet, and no mistakes, and that was all very good. When I then had to start improvising, when I played in church, it was utter panic. It was like what to do. Everything I do is, oh my God, that's a mistake. It's not written anywhere. And to overcome that fear took so many years. And so I think that there's so many levels on which this is in a way a problematic culture for us as musicians, and also with regards to, like, not every child that gets music lessons turns into a professional musician at some point. But what you want is that people take something from it, and that they love music, they care about music, and they understand something about it when they learn about it, even if they later on don't play so much, or they just turn into music lovers. But you don't want to turn them into fear-ridden beasts that jump when they're confronted with something that is actually a benign task in a way.
Yeah, my goal in education is to turn everyone into a musician. And then I'm not saying that everyone should play a music instrument, because that's not how I define a musician. But I see music as a biological feature of human beings. I don't know if you know Henk-Jan Honing's book, Iedereen is muzikaal. Everyone is musical.
Yeah, I know the title, yeah.
He's a cognitive neuroscientist in Amsterdam. The idea that language and music are universal is an important aspect of neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And we're not really doing anything with that in our culture. We see music as something you can learn. But of course, we don't say that about language. Language is not something you can learn if you want. No, language is, everyone speaks a language, and everyone is actually a musician. We sing. And so the incorporation of singing and rhythm and dance into normal life should be a goal in education, but also in raising children.
The idea of music as a language, as a universal language. Now, I'm thinking, with languages, you have many different languages, and then those are subdivided into dialects. Yeah. How would it apply to music? I mean, without actually, any sort of prejudice about sort of what the background is, but languages are also shaped by cultural backgrounds, by geographical backgrounds, possibly, that all these things. For music, language, is there a way to say that, like, for some people, certain musical languages are their mother tongue, rather than others.
Yeah. I mean, we don't really realize that until you meet somebody from Syria or who sings in a different intonation.
Right.
But we sing a scale that we have learned as infants, actually very, very quickly. And actually, there's a big relationship between the language we speak and the music we make. There's an interesting study done by Aniruddh Patel, a rather well-known neuroscientist, in which he compared European languages to European music.
Oh, that's
interesting. And he found a very clear relationship between the music made in a certain country with, and I'm talking about art music composers, and the language they spoke. There was one exception which I thought was very, very curious. That was 18th century Germany. It was Italian. The music was Italian, and that in the course of the 18th century, it changed from Italian to German. I can recommend that.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting, I think, and from a musicological point of view, very defendable that would take place. But that's something that he found just by analysis of language and music. Yeah. Just going back to what I just forgot, we don't teach children to improvise in language either. I mean, we improvise in daily life. But we never teach children to do oratory anymore. I think that that's a missed chance to teach children how to just get up in front of the class and improvise a short speech,
right.
And when they get to the university, to actually participate in debates and to do oratory and that sort of thing, which was very, very popular in the past, but has kind of died out, which means that that we don't confront children even with this aspect of their development in their own language.
Yeah,
it's not only a musical problem; it's also a language problem. I think. Yeah.
When you're playing music that is 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years old, and you're bringing it nowadays to the public, that like, aren't you some sort of museum keeper? And the argument is always, of course, no, that music is still valid and has still something very intrinsic to tell us about the human condition, about the divine, about whatever. But in a way, that the danger is that if we lose that communicative aspect of it, that in fact we do become some sort of museum keepers, and that our performances turn into museum pieces that are just looked at from a distance, and you say that like, yes, it's beautiful, but it doesn't speak to me in a way, which is of course the last thing we should want, because the question is then really like, how many more museum pieces do we need like that? Going back, for instance, to the recording industry, you already see that the globalization of the musical market leads to the fact that in the end, a handful of pianists would be perfectly capable of providing the global music market with recordings of all the pieces 99% of people would ever listen to. And once you've got those recordings, why would you need another one? Why would you need to go to a concert to actually listen to that? And
if you go into the world of art, of course, we have paintings, and then you have restoration, and buildings are being restored, and then of course you have this big problem: should we restore this palace in the original state? Now you have it with organs, for example. Should the organ be restored to the original organ that was built, or should we also keep something that was actually restored in 1840 and changed? Or we're not. As classical musicians, we're not in the restoration business. I think that there are art forms. So, as for example, the Netherlands Opera is a very well-known opera company nowadays. But of course, many of their productions, they actually change the original intentions of the composer, and even change things in the score to be able to communicate with their audience, and you see that happening more and more. Of course, that's an aesthetic decision to take, but it's in any case that type of musicking is based on skills that we don't all have anymore, and that we should be teaching to our students to prepare them for a future career. Because we have no idea what direction classical music is taking, but we have to give them a broader palette of skills to deal with situations they will run into in the future, which will be completely different than what we have experienced in the past, I'm sure. It's a difficult topic. I saw recently a video at the Globe Theatre in London. They have experimented with productions of Shakespeare
with his original accent.
And of course, although that...
From oar to oar we wrought.
I mean, it's difficult to understand.
Yeah.
So it's not something for a broader audience. But of course, the jokes Shakespeare is making that you can understand in the older pronunciation are fantastic. So I think that we have to realize that understanding music as it was originally meant is just as important as understanding Shakespeare the way he meant it. It's not for a broader audience. I don't think it is for a real broader audience. But I do think that we have to realize that language as well as music is not divorced from the past. Language is based, I mean, even the language we speak is based on the language Shakespeare spoke. And jazz music is based on classical music, among other things. As far as your heritage, I have a colleague in Holland, I don't know if you know Rembrandt Frerichs, jazz pianist.
Yes, I know.
He plays on a Walter fortepiano.
Yes, I remember,
why not?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, of course you can use an older organ in a modern style. Why not? And I think that if organists would experiment with this sort of thing, that they might find an audience for it.
Right.
I mean, Frerichs has found an audience for what he's doing, and so there are many different possibilities for musicians to communicate with their audiences and to communicate with diverse audiences.
Right.
You have to want to do that. You have to want to communicate, and you want to communicate to a particular audience. I mean, you don't. When you speak to someone, you're speaking to that person, and not just to a wall or to an audience. You're speaking to particular people who have particular expectations, and these audiences can be very different. But obviously, I think there's an audience for a lot of music.
It's because you just mentioned jazz. It reminds me that when we were talking before about the lack of feedback from the audience, or the fear that comes from suddenly thinking that like I'm doing nothing to them. That in a way, the way the jazz circuit handles it, with, for instance, like a short burst of applause after a specific solo or something like that, is in a way, it's exactly this. It's the communication between audience and the musician. The musician tells something, the audience shows its appreciation. Now, I'm not saying that we have to emulate exactly that for the classical
concept. It happens
concept.
in opera.
It happens in opera, for instance. Yeah. And
nowadays it's happening even more in concerts, that, for example, after a first movement, that the audience will start clapping, and of course the musicians look like, well, this is incorrect, but actually we should all be wanting an audience to respond. And
the question is only sometimes what I realize is when I see that happen in concerts here in our church, then like, okay, the first piece happens, okay, no applause. Second piece happens, no applause. Third piece happens, oh, they really like that, and there's some applause. But now they've applauded once, and now they feel the obligation to applaud after every single piece, because otherwise the musician will think we didn't like that one. So it's tricky. You can feel in a way the awkwardness, because we don't. There's something very comforting about established traditions, and where everybody knows what they have to do. for me, as a church musician, one of the last things I did when I was still in Holland, I was at the Onze Lieve Vrouwenkerk in Amsterdam, the conductor and organist, and I had a Renaissance choir formed, and the idea was specifically not to perform in a concert environment, but actually to perform a Josquin Mass in its originally intended background, which is a mass.
Yeah.
To have it as in a mass with everything sung, and then I got a priest who was enthusiastic about it and who would sing all the responses and who could even sing a reading and all these things. And suddenly the whole thing gets a new dimension because you suddenly understand what you're communicating.
Exactly.
No?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we want to achieve in every music.
Exactly.
Communication. Yeah, I deal myself in my own work more with the skills that young students are learning to prepare them for the future. And of course, this is one of the things that they have to think about we call that entrepreneurship. But we mean actually by that artistic entrepreneurship. How do you communicate by other means than just the playing?
Yeah, exactly.
How can you use the setting? How can you use the format to communicate and to reach audiences? But the other aspect, of course, of the musician is what do you learn to do? We also teach them how to speak in public because we think it's important that they, even if they don't always do that, that they are capable of stepping out on the stage and speaking to their audience and not only playing for them. And so it's actually... the idea is that the skills that they learn are not only different in terms of being able to speak the musical language, but also in terms of communication with their audience, broader style, mastery of styles, being able to perform in different settings, which also means for a lot of musicians that's very, very difficult. If you suddenly are on stage and everybody's standing around the piano, and then you have to play. I mean, that's if you're not used to doing that, that's something you have to learn. So we're trying to teach students a broader set of skills, and in particular skills that are much more related to what other musicians like jazz musicians and 18th century musicians mastered before us, and in terms of oratory, what people were able of doing to do in the until the 19th century. So that's kind of where we're going.
The one thing I would add to that is that I believe that there's still, it depends on where you are. There's in Northern Europe, we're a lot further thinking about certain things in a different way than, for instance, in Vienna still, or Southern Europe or Eastern Europe. I had last year, actually, I had a job interview in Vienna at Conservatory, and that was exactly about I had to make a presentation which was exactly about a lot of these things, and one of my ideas was that they have 10 piano classes there, and this is not like just some private conservatory. That's not the Hochschule, but it's very good. They're all training to be professional pianists. So you've got 10 piano classes, each of them with at least 10 students. So you've got 100 young pianists there. And there were actually in the jury, afterwards we had a discussion, and there were some student representatives. And the first question the student representative asked me whether I would send a student, because I made a presentation also about Beethoven Moonlight Sonata, about some performance practice aspects about it. And I changed a lot around of like how it could be performed. And my whole idea was just like, I want to give this to you. I want to present you with a couple of facts that make you maybe rethink like what you're doing and open up the perspective of like, hey, it could be done like that as well. As a student, I think you should be interested in something new, and that was the idea behind it. But the question that came was like, would you send a student like that to play in a competition? And if young people nowadays at the conservatory really still believe that competitions are like, I mean, I know competitions work for some people, but it's the nature of a competition that it works only for a select few, and not as an educational concept for a whole group of people, for all students. And one of my ideas was very much that, like what I discovered for myself is that I started as an organist with an interest in early music and historical organs. Perfect. Okay. Now I'm one of 100,000. Just a number. But then I started doing some more organization. So I did the project management degree. And then I developed my other keen interest in filmmaking. And I started making documentaries, or at least so far I have one larger documentary about historical organ, the Gothic organ in Soest-Oostende. And suddenly I found myself a niche where I'm one of 5, one of 10 people maybe in the whole world that does this kind of thing, because I have a very unique combination of things. And that is also where I think that why the question like what role does music play in our world nowadays becomes important again, because that's when we find like what other things do drive us instead of like the pure hyper specialization that goes on. Okay, let's put it that way. I think that a problem we have nowadays also for lots of musicians, and there's actually some research in that direction as well, that many students, once they finish their studies, they have a psychologically rather hard time, because they realize that a lot of the skills when it comes to performing a piece to the utmost high standard is not something that a large market is waiting for. And in the end, there is, of course, the dream for many people to actually, make a living doing this kind of thing. And for many people, it ends up that a few years after their studies, and in a way that applies to me as well, they start taking additional classes on something, they study something else, or they just learn a practical job that helps them to live. And I think by incorporating this sort of approach into, or the question, to actually ask that question already during the studies, actually, what role do you think does music play in our world, and what role could you play in that part? Where do you see that you can bring actually something to people, rather than just hoping to become famous? There is a tendency that people just want to become famous, even though they don't know how and why and for what. But the main thing is you get famous. And for musicians also, there is, I think, underlying the danger that like the hope or the idea of making it consists of becoming famous, playing your instrument, sort of as a dream career. And I think the further we move away from that, the healthier it is, I think.
Yeah. On the other hand, I don't see a big reason to let go of our professional goal of virtuosity. The idea persists that the only way to develop this high level of playing on your instrument is by the way we have been teaching for the last 150 years. I really don't believe in that. I believe that a different way of teaching music and teaching the instrument and approaching the whole field of music does not conflict with the idea of playing an instrument well. I do not believe that Johann Sebastian Bach did not play well, to put it in that way. Yeah, and all the great pianists of the up until the middle of the 19th century were all improvising musicians.
But it depends on what we define as well, because
I believe that they probably made mistakes.
Yeah, like Courteau did a lot.
Yeah, like we do in normal speeching, and we because we are improvising. We commonly make mistakes. You can't record that and sell it as a CD. Yeah, that's our problem. Yeah. I don't think, and you can't play it at a competition. Yeah, but of course that's not the goal of life, to make CDs and to win competitions. But if you say that playing well is an aesthetic goal, or technically mastering your instrument is a goal of, I see that as quite possible. What I see actually in teaching, and then I'm talking more about the early levels of teaching that we described earlier, is that it goes so slow. While that's not necessary at all, teaching, you can learn to play an instrument, especially something like a piano, which is very easy. You can learn to play that rather quickly,
Right.
but not by the methods that we're using. We're kind of slowing the whole process down by changing it into this idea of playing the notes that are written.
Yeah.
But if you just discard the notes and teach people how to play, how to improvise on their instrument, well, it's actually rather easy. And then, of course, you run into the problem that you then have to teach them how to read if they're going to have access to literature, which is, I think, a separate problem. Literacy, I see as a separate problem. I don't see any methods out there to teach people to read, to be perfectly honest. They would still have to be developed.
Yeah.
I developed one for score reading in Groningen. Yeah. It's quite easy to do, but it's a lot of work. Of course, you can reach a high level of playing.
Yeah. What you said about like musical excellency or as a goal, that's certainly, I think, something that nobody wants to abandon that. And actually thinking back, at the beginning of my master's, I did a 3-month exchange. Was it an exchange or something like that? I went for 3 months as a visiting researcher to the US, to Notre Dame University in Indiana. And of course, it's one of those fancy universities. Every year they build a new building, and they had a new music center, new organ. It was all state of the art. It was fantastic. Now the music department isn't like a dedicated conservatory department, as in that people major in music. All of those people studying there were minor subjects, students. There was a guy who studied, I think, something with biology, and I heard his final exam, and he played, I think, First Symphony by Vierne. And listening to that, I thought, it's not like I haven't heard it played better at some point, even though better is always, it's a relative term again. But he could play, and he could play very well. And the difference of level compared to the dedicated conservatories we have in Europe was minuscule, I would say. And but at the same time, there was a guy who was actually going to earn his living doing something completely different later on, while still having a high level of playing. And I think that was a system where I thought, like, there's something to be said for that as well. I think so.
Yeah. Of course, we hope in the Netherlands, probably it's the same situation here in Germany. We hope in the Netherlands that the universities and the vocational, the HBO, which the conservatory is, that distinction will disappear,
right?
And that in the future, students studying medicine will be able to study within the same institution. Yeah. Right now, we have students who are studying medicine and, for example, violin. Yeah. Very few of them, of course, or physics and cello, but that should be normal. I think. Yeah.
In Germany, you used to have the so-called duales Ausbildungssystem, and there's still remnants of that, but it's been significantly weakened. Okay. And just because of you probably know the numbers yourself. The numbers of overall students exploded since the 60s, which in a way is a great thing because many more people can study nowadays. The problem is that people are thrown into having to study. So many people, I've recently seen a documentary also about that, young people that just study because they want a better life, even though they don't know exactly what they want to study. Yeah. They just think that, if I take a loan and use all the money my grandpa earned all his life and I move to London and study there at some elite university, I'm going to get a great job and have a better life. And that equation doesn't add up anymore completely.
Okay. I believe that.
Because there's just too many people doing the same thing. And I think that what the next step will be a certain rediscovery of like this sort of thing that craftsmanship, for instance, a strengthening of craftsmanship again, but also like dividing the studies between something where you say like, okay, this is something that can earn me a living realistically, but at the same time I also do something vocational, as you said. I think for many musicians that is something that's anyway inevitable sooner or later. But I think people would profit from it if they would do it sooner rather
Yeah,
than
it's
later.
my own personal experience. I mean, I've studied music, human movement science and neuroscience.
Yeah.
I think the broader your education is, the more you will be able to use it in a particular vocation that you choose. Which I mean, I teach at a conservatory.
Yeah.
But so I'm not a practicing scientist in that sense. But it offers a completely different perspective on the work you're doing.
Of
so
course,
I would recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as a closing idea, where would you think education should be going these days?
Yeah, I think it's nothing new to say that we should be using the scientific knowledge that we have now to and applying that in education. I think that's pretty a logical thing to say. I think that we're not doing that. So I think it's time that we seriously take a good look at what we're doing. Right now in Groningen, we are trying to develop a new bachelor curriculum at the Conservatory for Classical Music. This is the time to actually think about the whole concept of classical music, the training that we're giving our students, and redesigning it in terms of what we know now. So I think that's actually that would be my final comment. That we know a lot. Yeah, we're just not applying it. We're basing our methods, our curricula, we're basing it on tradition, and of course, tradition has great value, but it is one of the constraints on the curriculum of a professional music institution, I think.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for coming here. And it's been great talking to you. And hopefully next time, well, if you ever come to the area of Tangermunde, where we will be soon, we'll have a bigger studio, more space, a nicer view. And then we can maybe catch up on the latest developments.
Okay, and then of course I'd want to see the organ.
Oh, well, yes, of course. And feel free to improvise on it.
Okay, great. Okay.
Well, thanks.
Thanks so much for watching. Over the next couple of days I will be releasing the shorter versions of this interview, which I will probably put together into a playlist for easier reference. Also, stay tuned for the second episode where I will talk with David Engels on topics such as cultural morphology and also the political connotations of our times with regards to what we can learn from the likes of Spengler and others. So a very exciting topic. If you're interested, please, as always, leave a like, leave a subscribe, give a comment. What do you think about the topics we spoke about with Dr. Robert Harris? And if you have other suggestions, other topics that you would like to see treated, please leave me a comment and I will see if I can find some people who are willing to talk with me about this kind of things. So thanks again and see you soon. Bye.